誰為愛世人願捨身？這禮物化作活存的心靈，幸福是接受和活出這禮物的真諦，教我學習愛到痛時就如遇見主。人一生最如緊，豔陽縱使多耀眼，如若沒愛，彷彿天空阻隔了光線的障紋。請潔淨我心眼，長留着愛的恩泉，清澈璀璨。
2015年12月8日，教宗方濟各開啟咗聖伯多祿大殿嘅聖門，宣布慈悲禧年正式開始。天主教會本來每25年慶祝一次普通禧年，只有因為特別理由先至會慶祝特殊禧年。呢一次嘅慈悲特殊禧年由2015年12月8日聖母始胎無原罪瞻禮開始，到2016年嘅11月20日嘅基督普世君王節結束。禧年係一個彰顯救恩嘅時刻，教宗方濟各希望藉住呢一年邀請所有人跨越聖門，去尋找力量，擁抱天主嘅慈悲。要跨越聖門，信眾本來要千里迢迢去到幾間設有永久聖門嘅聖殿朝聖，但係教宗方濟各喺宣布慈悲禧年嘅詔書中，容許各個地方教會喺呢一個禧年裏面，於主教座堂同埋一啲有特別意義嘅聖堂，都打開一道聖門，並稱之為慈悲之門。喺多倫多總教區有9間聖堂設有慈悲之門，位於多倫多市中心嘅聖保祿大殿慈悲之門，亦都已經喺12月13日開啟咗啦。
My dear people of St. Paul's, with eyes fixed on Jesus and his merciful face, the Holy Father, on the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception, December the 8th, initiated an extraordinary jubilee, thus opening to us and to all men and women of faith the door of God's mercy. In communion with the Universal Church, this celebration marks the solemn beginning of the year of mercy. Lord Jesus, we ask you to put an end to our affliction and suffering, our miscommunication, our backbiting, the spread of rumors, so that the grace of the Holy Door may open us more to the message of Christ. Let us now open the gates of justice. Let us open the door, so we shall enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the Lord's door. Let us enter through it and obtain mercy and forgiveness.
聖保祿大殿點解會被挑選設立慈悲之門呢？原來同佢接近200年嘅悠久歷史以及優美嘅建築息息相關。
今日我會同大家睇下我身後邊嘅聖保祿大殿聖 Basilica， 佢係多倫多天主教總教區第一個堂區，喺教區成立之前，佢就已經喺度㗎喇。
好多人都會留意到呢一間聖堂嘅名稱同一般聖堂有啲唔同。點解呢一間聖堂會被稱為大殿 Basilica 呢？一座聖堂要點樣先能夠得到大殿呢個稱號呢？
Many times when people come to St. Paul's, they want to know why it's a basilica. And they're often confused. They think it maybe is where the bishop says Mass. Bishop says Mass at a cathedral. A cathedral has the Latin word cathedra in it, which means means the chair, and it's where the bishop's chair is. That's what makes a cathedral a cathedral. It is where the bishop says Mass. What a basilica is a church quite simply that's honored for either a historical or other cultural reasons. In the case of St. Paul's, it's the original parish of Toronto.
聖保祿堂區創立於1822年，喺 喺19世紀初嘅安省，聖堂稀少，亦分佈得好疏落。嗰時只有溫莎市、京士頓同渥太華有聖堂。教區選擇喺多倫多興建聖保祿堂，係由於多倫多係一個港口，當時有好多人由歐洲嚟到北美洲，選擇喺多倫多定居。
The Pope realized that Ontario was growing and that they needed more than one bishop, more than one diocese. And so they started to divide up the diocese. They cut Toronto off from Kingston and said, Toronto will be a new diocese that includes Windsor and London and all of Northern Ontario. And so, of course, it was still a massive responsibility for the new bishop. And so Bishop Powers, the first bishop who was appointed to look after Toronto, and he came in 1842.
位於多倫多市中心嘅聖薇厄爾主教座堂係 Michael Power 主教喺1842年下令興建嘅。喺主教座堂起好之前，聖保祿堂就被用作為主教座堂。
That's part of the reason why I think St. Paul's is honored with the title of being a basilica. The second reason is the church itself, because it's a magnificent structure and it expresses so well a sense of the glory of worship. It is a particularly beautiful example of how we build churches and the architecture of Christian churches. People, by it being called a basilica, are invited to come here and see this as part of their own legacy as Catholic people, that this is a significant place to come to pilgrimage to. The idea of being a pilgrim for Christians is very important. And so we find sites where you can pilgrimage to make a particular commitment in your faith. St. Paul's in Toronto is one of those places.
聖保祿大殿除咗極具歷史價值，佢嘅建築亦都值得我哋細心欣賞。古羅馬嘅建築師維特魯威喺佢嘅著作裏面咁寫：所有建築物都有兩個元素，建築物本身以及建築師想要表達嘅概念。而已故教宗聖若望保祿二世亦都曾經講過，彌撒係地上嘅天堂。聖堂嘅建築旨在反映天人合一嘅欽崇，希望身處其中嘅人能夠體會到呢一點。聖堂唔單止讓信眾聚集，提供一個可以一齊朝拜天主嘅地方，聖堂嘅建築同裝飾更加幫助信眾構上一個記憶嘅空間，深化信仰。
Yeah, you know, there was a little study that was done that when we leave a room and pass through a doorway, our memory decreases. Have you ever had the experience of moving off to do something in another room and you go through the doorway and as you go out of the space, you forget why you got up to go to the other space? So there's something about physical space that provides memory cues for us. And when we've worshipped in a space, when we've been there with other people, the architecture, the detail of the architecture creates the memory space where we're shaping our faith memories. Church architecture is very important to create that memory space for those mysteries of our faith.
我哋特別邀請咗懷雅遜大學建築系嘅許教授 Vincent 為我哋講解。Vincent 本身係天主教徒，對聖堂建築又有濃厚興趣，由佢嚟解構聖保祿大殿嘅建築最適合不過。
喺我哋隔離嘅聖保祿大殿聖 Paul Basilica 喺1889年完成，當時嘅設計師咧係 Joseph Connolly， 亦都由 Timothy O'Mahony 主教監督之下咧先至起得好嘅。嗱，我知道成個聖堂長174尺，闊100尺啦。Vincent 可唔可以話俾我哋聽，究竟佢嘅建築風格係乜嘢呢？
The elevation of a building is indicative of what great splendors go on inside. However, as you can see in this building's elevation, what we have here is a prime example of Romanesque architecture. And it's drawing from a lot of historic European precedents that you find typically in, say, Alberti's Santa Maria Novella church in Florence. But what's really identifying this as a Romanesque piece of architecture is its symmetry and its elevation, its Roman flourishes, such as that which you see in the columns and certainly at the tops of the columns, and of course the finer details such as the semicircular archways and then also the pure thickness of the walls. One of the key identifiers in Romanesque architecture is the fact that there's a limited number of opportunities to put glass in. And what you see here by this elevation is that there's very few opportunities to see into the building. So what you see here is a very classical tie back to the great architecture that you're going to see once you get inside.
喺1905年，聖波就起咗呢個高129尺嘅鐘樓。究竟佢有乜嘢用途呢？
Bells in churches had a very practical purpose, and that was they called people to church. At one time, churches were built fairly close together, and if you drive around Toronto, you're surprised by the number of churches there are. People didn't have cars, they walked to church. The reason these early churches are close and also they have bell towers is they afforded the people the opportunity to come to Mass. And the bell tower said, it was usually rung maybe 10 minutes before Mass was beginning to say, get a move on, it's time to go to church. We still ring the bell here before Masses on Saturday and Sunday. I don't think people are listening for the bells as a way to be called to church, but they're part of our tradition.
我留意到聖坡嘅座向咧，其實同好多天主教嘅傳統聖堂都好相似，都係坐東向西。咁即係話祭台位於東邊啦，因為日出係象徵耶穌基督嘅復活。
Architecture is one of those disciplines that's absolutely saturated with symbolism. So obviously the connections between the rising of the sun and the resurrection of the Son of God obviously have to be made. But I'd like to think that in architecture, that tradition has cascaded into a more functional purpose. The illumination that comes about from the rising of the sun all the way to the setting of the sun with that east-west orientation allows for greater illumination of stained glass and certainly illumination so that people can actually read their hymnals.
聖堂我哋個個禮拜都會去啦，但我知道以建築學嚟講咧，聖堂嘅每一個部位都有個獨特嘅名稱嘅，好似我哋身處呢度咁樣咧，平時我哋叫佢做大堂，咁實際上應該叫做乜嘢名咧？
This is called the narthex. And typically this has been the barrier zone within a church that separated the secular from the sacred, that is to say, the church itself. And if you understand the architecture of a church as a series of transitions, this is the first gate, and it typically has been an area to remind people that, hey, that's the public world, and as you come through this area, typically we found baptismal fonts and various other elements to remind people coming through that this is part of the initiation of becoming part of the church. And once you pass that barrier, then you're able to go into the rest of the church. Now, in current churches, what we often find is that we still have communal areas, but they're not often referred to as narthexes. What they often do is just still allow for a lot of communal activity to happen between both worlds.
咦？平時喺其他聖堂都未見過呢樣嘢，成把遮咁樣嘅。喂 ，Vincent 呢把咩嚟㗎？
Well, this is called an ombrellino, and it's a signifier from the Vatican, basically saying that this church is now considered a minor basilica. And what that basically means is that it is the center, or it has a lot of relevance for the Archdiocese of Toronto. So what you can see here is the coat of arms for the Archdiocese of Toronto, as well as the coat of arms for the Vatican.
除咗 Umbrellino 宗座華蓋之外，喺大殿祭台旁邊仲有一個 Tintinnabulum 宗座鈴，兩者都係聖殿嘅標記。呢一啲標記嘅起源要追溯到中世紀嘅一啲習俗。
And now you have to imagine we're living a long time ago, maybe in the Middle Ages of Europe, and there are important men, kings, lords, bishops, and they're coming to the Basilica because they want to take some time in prayer. And so as they come to the Basilica, they have their servants hold an umbrella over their head in case it's rainy or too hot. And before them, another servant goes along ringing a bell, saying to all, here comes an important man. And so the bell is rung, and the Lord or the bishop marches along under his umbrella, and he comes to the Basilica to worship. So wherever you go now in the world, in North America, in Asia, in Europe, if a church has been designated As a basilica, you will find an umbrellino and you will find a tintinnabulum.
嗱，呢個咧就係成間聖堂入面最大一個部分啦。咁佢又叫乜嘢名咧？
Well, this area is referred to as the nave. And that's typically where you find the pews and where the rest of the congregation would actually be. And if you look at the word by definition, it comes from maritime route, basically where we have a lot of heritage dealing with the ark and how the church itself is basically an ark that buffets from the rest of the sin and calumny that you find in the rest of the world. But from an architectural standpoint, if we look at what's going on here, you'll notice that it is the largest space, not only to accommodate the population, but also it's the clearest space. It's clear of structure and clear of any obstructions, so that when you stand or sit here, you actually have a great view of everything in the church, from the altar all the way to the Stations of the Cross, to of course the choir and organ at the back. Typically, we often find that this area is the largest to reinforce the cruciform form plan of the building.
係喎，好似你正話所講，呢間聖堂係十字架佈陣，直情係一模一樣嘅。但我留意到咧，多倫多又唔係間間聖堂都係用咁樣嘅建築形式嘅，點解咧？
You're absolutely right. Typically, traditional churches have always been designed with a cruciform shape. And if you look at the way it's oriented and the way it's organized, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of stained glass windows and frescoes and paintings all around this building that showcase the story of various saints, in this case St. Paul, or the story of Jesus. However, once post-Vatican II happened, where a lot of changes in the way we actually practice our faith, we have things like practicing the Mass not in Latin, but in the vernacular language. And of course, there was a focus more on the community. And often what you find in new churches is that the cruciform shape, though it's very symbolic, has been kind of put aside in order to ensure that there's a greater fostering of community. And that's what happens as you see in more and more churches nowadays. They're actually less about the cruciform, because no one ever sees the floor plan of a church, but instead it's talking about bringing people closer together and surrounding a specific altar.
Vincent 啊，可唔可以同我哋講下中殿 nave 嘅建築特色係乜嘢？
So the nave is the major space where the congregation sits. However, it's flanked by two other zones off to the side, which are basically arcades defined by these columns. Again, to reinforce the Romanesque architecture here, you notice that the columns come up to the top where they actually hit a semicircular arch. Now, that area off to the sides of either of the nave basically allow for other functions, typically the Stations of the Cross, and as you can see here, even confessionals.
我正話記得你講過咧，話啲柱咧其實都係好有功用同埋好特別嘅。嗱，我見到咧每條柱咧上面又有啲好似好特別嘅圖案啦，有冇特別名稱嘅？
So these are limestone columns, and as you can see, they're perfect circles at the base, but then they kind of come up to these really great flourishes. Now, though they look very simple, that's typical of the Doric order, so it's very plain and simple. However, as you go up, you'll find that they do these scroll pediments and scroll tops, and that's typical in Ionic orders. And then what's really hybridizing in this case is that we have a bunch of floral flourishes at the top. They look kind of like plants, and that's really a derivative of the Corinthian order. So in this base column here, we have a combination of three different components that make for something that's unique in the Romanesque architecture here.
聖堂嘅設計同建築都係為咗配合信友朝拜天主，而喺禮儀當中，音樂係非常之重要。喺聖堂入面，又點可以欠缺樂器之王管風琴呢？
This organ was built in 1898 by the R.S. Williams organ company. So this is one of the only remaining R.S. Williams instruments in Canada. And it's an all-wood instrument, which is also a little bit strange. A lot of instruments have some metal as well as the wood. And the other thing about it for organists, which is interesting, is that the pedal board that you see where I play with my feet is completely flat. Usually on organs, the pedal board is concave, which allows a little bit more easier access to the outer notes. But this is completely flat, so the movement for some organists needs to be adjusted when playing on this instrument. But that's another kind of interesting aspect about this instrument. And the other thing is that it's a tracker organ, which means that every piston that I pull out is actually connected to a pipe. So there's no electronic help. It's all tracker-based.
如果大家岳高頭去望下聖堂嘅天花板咧，你會發覺總共有9塊嘅壁畫，咁全部都係講咧保祿由開始傳教到殉道時期嘅事蹟嘅。咁但係除咗講呢9塊壁畫之外咧，我想睇下成個天花板嘅設計咧，又有啲乜嘢風格咧？
So the ceiling is absolutely amazing as a vehicle to actually showcase a lot of the stories. Now you got to remember that in the old days, the church was conducting Mass in languages that may not have been familiar to the local population. So as a result, it's through the stained glass and through the paintings that you see that the stories of the church and the stories of Jesus would actually be told. Now, what's notable about this barrel vault of a ceiling is that we have a series of windows along the top which are called clear story, and that allows a lot of light to come in and fill not only the nave, but of course illuminate the ceiling. So what you can see here is it's describing the story of St. Paul, or Saul, as he's from his conversion all the way to his martyrdom. So it's a great vehicle to showcase stories.
成間聖堂咧就呈現十字架嘅形狀啊！嗱，呢家我哋企正個位咧，正正就係十字架嘅中心點。嗱，見到呢兩邊凹咗落去咧，就應該係十字架嘅左右臂啦。其實呢兩個臂又叫做乜嘢名咧？
Well, this area is called a transept. So what we're standing in is right now the area where the nave meets the transept. Basically, the transept is an area that's allocated so that you can have devotional spaces to, say, the Virgin Mary or perhaps the patron saint. Now, typically, if you find a church without a transept that's kind of classical and deals with more of the classical orders to ensure that there's a cruciform shape, if it's missing that, then that means there might have been, say, a fire or some sort of financial issue that's prevented that from happening. However, I want to reinforce the issue of how an architecture of a church is actually made, such that it's about thresholds. So if the narthex is about separating the secular world from the sacred world, the transept marks the threshold from the congregation to the more sacred space, the sanctuary, and where the sacraments are held.
十字架嘅最前方咧，我知佢叫咩名？佢叫做聖所。 因為呢個位置咧係擺正喺十字架嘅頭，係預留俾耶穌基督嘅。耶穌以基督了身嘅頭嚟説話，而神父係耶穌基督在世嘅代表，所以一般嚟講聖所咧都係預留俾神父，教友係唔應該入嚟嘅。而我哋作為平信徒嘅，應該坐喺中殿呢一度，因為我哋以基督了身嘅身體嘅方式嚟去參與彌撒。咁講真喎，原來透過聖堂嘅設計，我哋能夠更加明白信仰嘅真正意義啊！
Yes, you're absolutely right. So the way the sanctuary works is that it follows through very much along the lines of the Judeo-Christian model of arranging space.
呢一種劃分空間嘅方式，可以追溯至舊約時代以色列人聖殿嘅結構。嗰時嘅聖殿，外邦人同以色列人有唔同嘅空間，司祭同普通人亦都有唔同嘅空間，空間有等級之分。 而喺聖保祿大殿，我哋都可以留意到，要上一級先至進入到聖所。中殿同聖所嘅地板所用嘅物料亦都唔一樣。
Now, what's really interesting about the nature of this sanctuary is that it has the Eucharist kept at the very back of the apse, which is a little bit different from conventional churches. Also, that's just pretty much a holdover from the pre-Vatican II model of configuring churches, where the altar typically was faced at the very back of the apse, and the priest would have his back towards you. Here you can see the way the sanctuary is arranged is that the altar has been moved back a little bit from the very back of the church, such that you can actually have the priest stand and deliver Mass and face the congregation.
其實我知道咧，聖所嘅中心咧就係祭台。有啲書講過咧，祭台會令人聯想起最後晚餐入面嗰張台嘅，而祭台本身咧係用石頭做嘅，所以亦都象徵住祭獻嘅意思嘅。
So it's not a coincidence that the altar is the focal point of the actual building. Basically, in a church, everyone is facing the altar. All of the vectors within the church all face towards the core of activity, the fundamental sacrifice that's denoted by our faith, the sacrifice and the resurrection that's embodied in not only the Eucharist, but also in the Mass itself. And of course, it is a direct connection to the fresco that you see of the Last Supper in the background. Now, what's really important to keep in mind is that all of this activity is concentrated at the apse.
拱壁 apse 可以話係全間聖堂嘅頭，係最重要嘅部分。我哋最初由前廊 narthex 進入，經過中殿 nave 嚟到十字交匯處，面向拱壁，我哋見到兩幅壯麗嘅壁畫，聖保祿嘅歸化同埋最後晚餐。
Now, I want to draw your attention to a couple things about the apse itself. It houses not only the Eucharist over in the back there, but it also deals with the sacraments that happen at the altar, and it draws attention to everyone sitting in those pews to what's going on here.
喺每一間天主教聖堂入面，都會見到紀念耶穌苦難嘅14處苦路。喺聖坡呢度亦都唔例外，由南面嘅第一處開始，一路到環繞成間聖堂，去到北面嘅第14處，每一處苦路都係用石雕刻製作而成，非常美觀。傳統聖堂被設計成十字架形，其實亦都象徵住基督徒嘅信仰歷程。中殿嘅石柱就好似一啲支撐住我哋信仰嘅支柱，呢啲支柱引領住我哋仿效耶穌，慢慢步向十字架。聖保祿大殿見證住多倫多教區嘅成立同發展，佢典雅嘅建築不單止賞心悅目，更幫助人進一步了解基督信仰嘅意義。趁住慈悲禧年，邀請大家嚟到聖保祿大殿朝聖，除咗跨越慈悲之門，仲有更多寶藏等住你親身嚟睇一睇。
聖經係世界上面翻譯最多嘅書籍，而天主教第一套由原文翻譯嘅中文聖經，竟然出自一位外籍神父嘅手筆。真福雷永明神父係點樣完成呢一項艱巨嘅任務呢？聖經除咗有唔同文字嘅譯本之外，更加有唔同嘅表達方式。聖約翰聖經由一班書法家同埋美術家共同完成，被視為難得嘅藝術品。呢一套不一樣嘅聖經點樣啟發讀者呢？請留意呢一個星期嘅愛常傳。
睇完呢一集愛常傳，歡迎大家打我哋嘅熱線電話嚟分享一下你嘅感受或者故事，同時亦請收聽我哋逢星期六嘅電台節目愛生命。要購買天主教書籍同信仰靈修禮品，請嚟我哋嘅生命恩泉書社參觀選購。我哋下星期同樣時間再見，天主保佑。